welcome back to another episode of History Now. On today's show, we're going to be talking a bit about the Irish diaspora, the history of the Irish diaspora, particularly in Scotland. And joining me today is Dr Michael Connolly, who's going to be telling us about a really interesting and exciting project that he's been involved in over the last couple of years. So, Michael, you're very welcome to the show.
Barry, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss some of my research findings. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure because it's an interest not only in the field of history to me, but personally, and I think a lot of people are in the same boat, as it were. The migration from Ireland to Scotland there and back. My own family have done it, and I know yourself. So can we begin? It's about Brother Walfrid, a Morris brother who came to Glasgow from Ireland and helped establish, Celtic Football Club. So a lot of people will know him who are interested in football. But later on in the interview, we're going to get in behind the Brother Walfrid to the real person. So can you begin by telling me how you became involved in this project?
Yeah, so the project started in earnest in 2017. From my perspective, that's when I enrolled at the University of Stirling and began the postgraduate journey, as it were. Although the project had been a few years in the making prior to that. The kind of background to the project from the company who sponsored my PhD research project. They're called the Nine Muses, who are a Glasgow arts-based company who specialise in the work of the Scottish renowned artist Peter Howson. So they originally commissioned Peter Howson to about 12 years ago to produce a portrait, so the kind of defining image of Brother Walfrid, as it were. That was commissioned, as I said, around 2010 and came to fruition around 2012, 2013. So it kind of coincided with the 125th anniversary of Celtic Football Club. And the images became, I suppose, really well known within the Celtic support. It actually hangs in St Mary's Chapel in the East End of Glasgow in the Calton. Which is synonymous with the origins of Celtic Football Club. It's exactly where Brother Walfrid was able to gather together disparate elements of the Irish diaspora community in Glasgow and put the wheels in motion, so to speak, in terms of establishing Celtic Football Club way back in 1887. So from my own point of view, my background is quite simple in terms of I'm a Celtic supporter myself. I'm kind of born and raised just outside Glasgow, and some of my earliest memories are being taken on the supporters bus to the games from where I live just outside Glasgow with my dad, and I've always had a great passion that I've inherited from my dad for football generally, but of course Celtic is my team. So when I got word that there was this research project going to happen, I really jumped at the opportunity, and it was something that I'll never regret. Really, it's been an amazing journey.
You mentioned there, the commissioned painting of Brother Walfrid, and I suppose knowing a bit about this figure, we only have this really famous photograph of him, and he seems shrouded in mystery. So it seems that you've uncovered some things at long last about him. So can I take that and look at the man behind Brother Walfrid? His name was Andrew Kerins, and he came from Sligo. So can we talk a bit about who he was and the environment he grew up in Sligo?
Yeah, so I suppose that was the remit that I got from my perspective back in 2017, was to really tell the story behind the image, behind the famous image of Walfrid and the Marish religious attire that's most commonly associated with him, and also with the recent kind of Peter Howson piece, which kind of really evokes his origins in, as you mentioned, the west coast of Ireland. He was born in County Sligo, a really small rural town called Ballymote, which I was able to visit as part of the research project itself. I felt it was really important to be there and almost see the lay of the land, the places that would have been significant to a young Andrew Kerins. We have to bear in mind that he left Ireland aged 15, just 15, having to leave his parents, his older brother, on account of course, the period known as Angorta Mór, or the Great Hunger. So Walfrid was born in 1840, just a few short years before the horrors of that human catastrophe began to really take hold, and he was but one of over 1 million plus Irish refugees from that humanitarian disaster, who had to flee their homeland and seek refuge, shelter, a better life for themselves abroad, and that's what Brother Walfrid, of course, had to do in 1855 when he crossed the Irish Sea aboard a coal boat. So in many cases, for those who didn't have the means, for example, to travel like the majority of the Irish did to the United States or Canada, they had to pass to the United Kingdom or Britain at the time, aboard these kind of coal boat ships or ships, taking livestock across to Britain. So that's exactly the category that Brother Walfrid fell into. Andrew Kerins was joined by a childhood friend who was also 15 at that time, so he had company on that journey. But you can just imagine the shock of an alien culture, a totally different surrounding to the really rural, farming background that Walfrid was raised in, as part of the Kerins farmstead that he was born on and grew up in rural Ballymote, and arriving down the Brumelaw in Glasgow to the smoke and the sound and the engines of the Industrial Revolution, and what was then described as the second city of the empire. So a really heavily industrialised urban population, which was it was rising at a rate that's never been seen before or since, and obviously the Irish were also arriving into that atmosphere, so it would have been a real shock to the system without doubt, especially at that young age. But obviously Walfrid was able to place roots there, and I'm sure that we'll speak about this later in the interview, but I think his strength of faith, his Catholicism, was the real the basis for all his future endeavours in life, and that was the real anchor for him.
His time in Glasgow is very important, and I want to go back to that, but I want to talk now something about your sources, because in the parts that I've read of your work, you talked about the challenges of finding these sources, because as viewers will know, that 2022 we're in the decade of centenaries. 1922, you had the start of the Civil War and the destruction of the forecourts, which held all the census data for Ireland in Brother Walfrid's time. So, given that a lot of important sources were destroyed, how did you navigate around that to get a bit of background on Walfrid and his his place in the world?
Yeah, so I suppose I inherited a kind of basic understanding, or a skeleton idea of Walfrid's life, where he was at certain points, and where he went to later in life. But I felt that the real kind of contribution to our understanding of Walfrid as a figure was certainly to look at those roots in Ireland, and as you say, for anyone who's attempted to learn more about their own Irish roots and their own family history, genealogy can be a tough nut to crack in terms of the dearth of sources that survive after the famous kind of Four Courts fire during the Irish Civil War. So there was that challenge, but I was fortunate here in Glasgow in terms of we have a family history centre at the Mitchell Library. Dr Irene O'Brien was a great kind of wealth of knowledge in terms of working with Irish family histories and filling those gaps that obviously are there in terms of the census, especially that was destroyed in that unfortunate fire. But there was different means and different ways that I went about filling those gaps. So certainly we had the tithe allotments were one such documentary form of evidence, which was a great way of kind of putting some flesh on the kind of family origins of Kerins, his familial connections. He had the older brother, his parents. Obviously we know that primogeniture, that ancient kind of Irish tradition of the oldest son inheriting the land, was something that would have really had held a lot of sway over Walfrid's life, or Andrew Kerins at that point, and that his older brother Peter would have inherited the land, hence the younger brother Andrew's decision to depart for Glasgow. But also from speaking to surviving descendants of Brother Walfrid, so surviving members of the family in Ballymote, I was also placed in contact with some Kerins family members here in Scotland and in England as well. So there was a lot of emails going back and forth, and through that process we were able to gain a kind of understanding of what stories had been passed down, what we know in terms of knowledge and narratives that had been passed down through the family. So through that process I was able to kind of bring those threads together and put some kind of flesh on the somewhat sketchy understanding that we had of Walfrid's formative years prior to the research project. So that was a great chance for me to make a contribution.
So you've talked briefly there about when he arrives in Glasgow. It's the second city of the empire, heavily industrialised, completely alien to someone from the rural background of Walfrid. Um, can you tell me a bit about where he settled, and indeed where the Irish population who came to Glasgow settled? Can we talk about, where that was, and what the numbers were like of the Irish population in Glasgow at that time?
Yeah, so Andrew Kerins is quite an interesting case in terms of the timing of his departure from Ireland and his arrival in Glasgow, because as we know in Gottermore, the horrors of the famine ran at their worst between 1847, Black 47, and 1852. But obviously we were able to establish through speaking with the family that Brother Walfrid arrived in Glasgow in 1855. So it's a number of years after the worst of the famine, as it's often called, had occurred. But obviously the shock of that event was long felt in the history of Ireland. It's only recently that the population has recovered to kind of comparable levels to what they were in the mid 19th century. So obviously Walfrid was part of that later wave of immigrants to Scotland, who of course were searching for employment, for work, for a means of sustaining themselves in this new alien culture. And he joined a community of over 100,000 Irish who had been displaced as a result of Angortamore. So in that sense, there is a likelihood that he would have had maybe connections, maybe friends or relatives or people that he knew from back home here in Glasgow. But like the vast majority of males who at that age who arrived in Glasgow, he set about securing work, and in his case we believe that he worked on the railways, which of course was that booming industry at the time, especially in the northeast of Glasgow, in the Townhead district, or the Garngard as it's known, and that's where we believe that Brother Walfrid settled in Glasgow. It's also, interestingly, exactly where the Maris brothers put down roots, establishing their first parish school connected to the St Mungo's parish in the Townhead district of Glasgow. So we believe that Brother Walfrid first came into contact with the brothers after a hard day's work on the railways or in one of the factories in that part of the city, at one of the Maris brothers' night schools. They were very famous in terms of promoting an atmosphere of self-improvement and affording that opportunity to young Irish Catholics who were able to or willing to avail of these classes that were provided by the Maris brothers, who'd arrived from London via their origins in Lyon in France. And of course the Maris brothers was the defining part of Brother Walfrid's later life.
We'll go on now to that which he's most connected with, and that's the football club. But that didn't come for maybe 30 years after his arrival. What was he doing after he joined the Maris brothers? 'Cause you talked about the emphasis they had on education, night education. From reading, what some of the snippets that you've written about this, it seems that the Irish in Scotland, due to that sort of those barriers that we've talked about, really had an ideology of self-reliance and pulling yourself up. How was he involved in that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much that was a result of a deliberate choice. I don't think there was many other options open to the newly arrived Irish in Glasgow, especially. They were more or less reliant on their own institutions, which they brought with them. Of course, the Catholic Church being the prime example, but also some of the other kind of self-help or self-improvement organisations. The St Vincent de Paul Society, of course, was closely aligned with those who made the moves to put Celtic Football Club in motion in 1887. And were very closely involved with the club for the first few years that Walfrid was in connection with Celtic in Glasgow. But it's always interesting to remember that Brother Walfrid was only formally connected to Celtic Football Club between 1887 and 1892, so only 5 years of his life. Walfrid lived to the age of 74, so that leaves us 60 plus years, which for the most part were unknown, then certainly lesser known in relation to his connection with Celtic Football Club. So that was a huge blank canvas for myself in terms of being able to paint the picture of where he was, what he was engaged in. But primarily as a Maris brother, Brother Walfrid was a Catholic teacher, so he was engaged in the education of young boys in the East End of Glasgow. After he decided to dedicate his life in service with the Maris brothers, he would have shown without doubt huge potential at those night classes that he attended, in order for the brothers to first of all have funded him to travel to France to train in their Marist ethos and tradition. It's there in the early 1860s that he's given the name and religion of Walfrid, who Saint Walfrid had recently been canonised in 1863, an Italian saint, hence the reason why slightly peculiar name of Walfrid was given to this young man from the west coast of Ireland. It wouldn't have been his choice, slightly different now in terms of Maris brothers who joined the institution, but Walfrid would have been given that name and religion. And then from that day forward, the rest of his working life, save for the final 3 years of his life, which were spent in retirement in Dumfries, before his passing in 1915, he was engaged in teaching children in Catholic schools, first of all in Glasgow, at St Mungo's, St Mary's, the Sacred Heart parish church that he himself established, and went on to serve for over 20 years. It was there as headmaster that he used his position of influence within the local Irish community to put in motion the moves that gave us Celtic Football Club on November the 6th, 1887. And latterly he was then more or less headhunted to go and act as headmaster in some of the big Maris Brothers schools in London, serving the Irish Catholic community there. So he certainly lived an itinerant life. He was well travelled, comparatively speaking. And his connection with the brothers, I'm sure, would have given him a lot of fulfilment and happiness in his life. I'm sure some of that comes out in the research as well.
Yeah. This is something that just occurred to me is the fact that he's from the west of Ireland at that point, and we've spoken about how that the alien culture in terms of industrialization heavily urbanized. A lot of the Irish immigrants to Scotland at this time had the other barrier, which was the language barrier. Speaking Irish, is there any sense of Brother Walfrid's native tongue? Was he a native Irish speaker, or did he have any issues in that sort of realm when he came to Glasgow?
Yeah, well, we know Sligo and Connaught was part of the Gaeltacht, and from later census returns, we know that both Irish and English were spoken in the Kerins household. So, um, from speaking to the surviving relatives of Brother Walfrid, we know that Irish was spoken in the family home in Ballymote. So, I'd imagine there would have been an element of, you know, di- not only differences in culture and surroundings, but also in faith, of course. The Protestant Reformation had basically wiped out Catholicism in Scotland prior to the arrival of the Irish after the Great Famine. Um, but also added to that, you've just touched on another element that maybe would have produced a kind of another barrier or challenge that Walfrid had to overcome. But yeah, it seems that he was educated in both English and Irish prior to his arrival in Glasgow.
So I want to come back to the establishment of the football club. A very famous documentary that came out maybe about 15, 16 years ago, featuring your supervisor and Sir Tom Devine, another person I've had on the show. And in it, they spoke about how 30 odd years since Walford's arrival, he was in the East End. He saw that the people there hadn't really risen that much to the level of basically that there were the level of quality of life that they had maybe even in Ireland, but certainly when they came to Glasgow in the mid-century, they hadn't went up the social ladder as much. How much of that, and the state of the children of those people who emigrated, weighed on his mind when he decided to form the football club?
I always return back to his point of arrival as a 15-year-old on the Brumelaw and the banks of the River Clyde in the centre of Glasgow, and think this figure arrives as a 15-year-old child. So I often feel that as a Maris brother, as a head teacher, later in life, certainly through the documentary evidence that we've uncovered, you get that sense that he had a real genuine compassion and almost sympathy for children in a similar position as to himself back in 1855, and certainly in his day job as a Maris brother, as a teacher, he would have become acutely aware of some of the societal problems that were presenting themselves with the children who were fortunate enough to be able to afford the fees to come along to school. A lot of the fees were symbolic or covered by the St Vincent de Paul Society, but in that job he would have got a real almost acute kind of sense of the hunger, the lack of food, of basic materials, of clothes, of shoes in many cases, and it's that experience, I believe, that gave him the kind of drive and motivation to do what he did.
That's what I was going to ask next about his legacy. You've mentioned that his time with the football club was relatively brief, but the fact that it was established, part, it was established on a charitable basis, to feed the poor of the East End of Glasgow. Given that was, its mission, how do you see Walford's legacy on the club today?
Yeah, well, that's really important and significant in terms of Celtic has more or less a written constitution, which we believe was written by the hand of Brother Walfrid. It bears all the hallmarks of his own personal writings that I've uncovered over the course of the 4 year research project. And he states, he makes it explicitly clear that the football club is formed as a direct vehicle to raise funds for the charity that both he and a fellow Marist brother, Brother Dorotheus, had instituted in 1884, just 3 years before the football club was established, and that was the Poor Children's Dinner Tables charity, which can be understood as a school feeding programme. So, it offered children the promise of a square meal for the symbolic fee of a penny, or in the cases of extreme want where they could not afford that penny, it was covered by the charity itself and the monies raised. So, in his day job, he was able to see that need, and had the wherewithal and the determination to go about raising funds in whatever way he felt would be the most efficient in that manner. And of course, the idea that he settled upon was through forming a football club. So Celtic has its roots in that that attitude of wanting to make a difference, and certainly in terms of modern day, the club's activities in the modern age. Obviously, football is very much it's a multi-million-pound or billion-pound industry, and some of the fees that we see discussed in the media for player transfers and weekly wages of players are grotesque, to say the least, when we are fully aware of the prevalence of poverty, especially parts of Glasgow, I'm sure in parts of Ireland as well. But the football club retains that ethos, that almost that idea that was instilled in the club at its birth. So it's in the DNA of Celtic to retain a charitable function.
I could talk for hours about this topic. It's fascinated me since I was a kid. Just one last thing. You're hoping to publish this in book form. Can you tell us? You probably are not at that stage yet, but are you hoping it comes out as a publication?
Yeah, fingers crossed. Ideally, we would love to make that happen. As you suggested there, Barry, we're still in the final stages of submitting the final thesis to the university, and jumping those final hurdles. But once that's cleared, we've spoken to a few prospective publishers, and it's all about I feel in terms of this project, it's all about getting the right fit for the publication itself, making sure it ticks all the boxes, and ideally that's something I'd love to work towards over the coming months, and making that happen. But it's really strange to look back and feel almost that we've achieved that goal of working towards the PhD and the doctorate that we set back in 2017, and I hope it doesn't end here. I hope there's still a lot of kind of, a basic humanitarian level. There's a lot of good work.
Michael, thanks a million for joining me. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I really hope to read that book sometime in the future.
Thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity.